So welcome back to part 3 of Assembling Your Quilt. Today we'll be looking at the binding. And the binding is this nice finished edge that goes all around your quilt. It's the part that you want to set off the other colors in your quilt, so it needs to go with it just like everything else. Your binding will be a part of your quilt that gets really hard use. So you want to make sure you have a good binding. So stay tuned and we'll go through the process of making this together. I have a quarter of my quilt laid out here, and I have a few options for binding also laid out. Now, this is a good way to pick. So all of these pieces coordinate with fabric colors that are in my quilt. So I can, look in this and this and this. The big question I have is, what do I prefer? So these are options. I also have coordinating fabric from little pieces of jelly rolls from other projects. So these also coordinate with the colors of this quilt and could easily be stripped together into binding. So that's one option. Now, when you're looking at your fabric, for your binding, you're only looking at a really small bit that might go around the edge. So if you're undecided about which one you prefer, this is a good way. You can just go around with a few colors, lay them in, and see which ones you really prefer. So you can lay out a couple of options and say, well, I like this or this. You're only really going to be seeing about 1/4 of an inch on the front of it. This is another one. This looks unlikely, but it has a lot of the coordinating fabrics. So even though it's a big wild print, you're not going to be seeing that much of it when you put it on there. Honestly, I had thought a purple fabric, but I'm leaning toward this turquoise. I think it looks very nice. So, it depends on time. I may still strip things together, so I'm going to give that a little bit more thought too. So the winner of the fabric debate has turned out to be the turquoise fabric. The strip sets that I looked at I didn't like because although I like the idea of doing strip sets, this fabric seemed just too busy to have busyness going on along the edge. And this one just seems like an excellent anchor for the quilt. So it coordinates nicely throughout the quilt with other places. And it's just a solid border. So in the end, this is the one that I've decided that I like the best. I have my fabric here, and it's a super long piece that came off of the back of a quilt that I was working on before. So it's much longer than a normal piece of fabric. And what you want to look at when you're doing this, I know everybody does it differently, but this is the best way that I've found to get a square piece. I've ironed this first, and then I've folded it so that it hangs straight, so that you're getting the straight of grain. And once I've done that, I've came back here, and where I folded it on a line. So I know that I've got a straight edge all the way across, and I know all the fabrics are coming into that line. That's important because you don't want to get an L shape in your binding as you're working. So I'm going to come back to 2.5, and I cut my strips at 2.5 for my binding. That gives me a little increment to work it in. You could do a smaller piece, but it doesn't give you any give. I like this, it works for me. And I'm going to cut my strips at 2.5. Because these strips are so long, 3 of them is going to be plenty for my quilt. The next thing that I will do is I will join them together. Now we're going to join these on the diagonal. And this is how we will join all the binding strips together. You'll start with one side and you'll fold it over at a 45-degree angle. So you're just folding this little corner here until it reaches the edge right there. From there, you're going to take a little bit of glue. I use Elmer's washable school glue because it washes right out. And I'm going to run a bead of glue right there. And I'm going to lay this one with the right side to the right side here. So that they look like they're just perfectly lined up, which they should be. You're going to heat press this into place now. Give it just a minute. And the heat, pressing it is just there to make the glue solidify. So you just kind of look at it. You can kind of see the glue through there, so you can tell when it's starting to get a good join. You're going to turn it this way, and you can see that you've got a line there where you heat pressed. And you're going to take a marker, and this is just so that marking it with a marking tool just makes it easier to see when you take it over to your sewing machine. And a lot of that might depend on how well lit your sewing machine is, but it just makes it so much easier just to have a little mark there. So I'll mark that with some chalk. This is a little clover chalk pen. And then I'm going to take it over and press it at the sewing machine. Now I'm back over here, and I've laid down a stitch line at the sewing machine, so it's right where it was glued. Now I'm going to open this up like this. You just pop this open, and I'm going to trim this little triangle off, and I'll give it about 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be exact. This is just a seam allowance. Once I have that cut off, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to press this open. And you can just finger press this, or you can press it with your iron. The Elmer's washable school glue is, like I've said before, it's a starch product, and it just washes right out of your fabric. So it's nothing that you're going to have to worry about. You'll see that we'll lay a nice diagonal. What this does with the diagonal is the binding that you're going to do on your quilt is a double fold French binding. So you're going to fold it like this, and you're going to fold it again. So your diagonal is going to hit at different places along your quilt. So it's not one big bulky line. So that's the reason for joining on the diagonal when you do this, is because you've already got a lot of bulk that you'll be sewing through, plus your quilt in here. So you don't want to add to that any more than you have to. Now the next thing that you need to do is find an end and begin pressing. Here's one. You find an end and you begin pressing this in half like this. So you'll fold it and press it. I used to starch this, but I've decided the purpose of the starch is to get your binding to behave more like paper while you're working with it. But I found that adding the additional step for me just adds a lot of time, and it behaves a lot like paper anyway as you take it around your quilt. Now there is another method for cutting your binding, where you would cut it on the diagonal and then you would still join it on the diagonal. That becomes important if you have a quilt that has curved edges along the border. So, but this one doesn't have, you don't need any stretch. So it doesn't matter if it's cut on the diagonal. It will behave just fine for these straight edges that I have along this quilt. And so you just keep on and you press the entire thing. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to demonstrate with something just a little bit smaller so I can show you what I'm talking about. I can't get the whole quilt in my viewfinder field. So when you start out and you're laying out your binding, your edge is going to go along the edge of your quilt like this. And you're going to want to plan out kind of where your binding hits. So you're going to want to get your whole piece of binding that you have, and what you're looking for is you don't want the joins in your binding that you made earlier, like this diagonal join. You don't want this to hit in a corner area. So as you're laying out your binding, you might decide that you have to get another piece cut. But you want to know this in advance before you get into it, because you don't want to hit the corner and have any bulk at all in these corners. So you only want a thin piece of binding that doesn't have any joins in it when you hit your corners. So you need to look at that in advance. The other thing that you want to look at is I like to start at the bottom, usually on my bottom right corner if it's directional, but it doesn't matter. At the bottom, near a corner, and I want to give myself room to work up here. So you're going to have a flap that's probably at least the width of your hand, if not bigger. If you're making something smaller, the smaller area you leave yourself, the more difficult you're going to have to when you get to joining it. So you want to make sure that you have enough area here to work. So you're going to start with your seams, and you're going to start down here at the bottom. And just like everything else, you're going to start with a quarter inch seam. I'm running through a quick demo of how to do the corners of the binding. I'm sewing at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As I approach the corner, I'm going to fold, and I'll fold the binding, and then I'll take a 45-degree crease and I'll mark it with chalk. And the reason that I mark it with the chalk is just to make it more visible as I'm approaching it, because you can see you don't really see the crease as you're coming up on it. So I'm going to come right to the crease, and I'm going to put my needle in there, and then I'm going to turn the fabric toward the corner, and I'm going to sew off of the fabric. And then I'm going to clip my threads, and I'm going to turn my quilt at that point. Now as you go up, you're going to fold your binding along that 45-degree angle, and you're also going to fold it down. What it's going to look like is that your binding looks like it's even with the quilt at this point. It might hang over just a tiny bit, but not very much. And that's what it's going to look like. And then you're going to begin sewing along your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you're going to start at the very top. You're going to put it under the foot. You start at the very top, and you come down just like you were before along your 1/4 inch seam, and you go down your quilt, and you will follow along to the next edge. I'm sorry, you'll follow along that until you get to your next corner. And I'll run through this demonstration once again so you can see it. The process here will be exactly the same. As I approach the corner, I'm going to fold, and I'll fold the binding, and then I'll take a 45-degree crease and I'll mark it with chalk. And the reason that I mark it with the chalk is just to make it more visible as I'm approaching it, because you can see you don't really see the crease as you're coming up on it. So I'm going to come right to the crease, and I'm going to put my needle in there, and then I'm going to turn the fabric toward the corner, and I'm going to sew off of the fabric. And then I'm going to clip my threads, and I'm going to turn my quilt at that point. Now as you go up, you're going to fold your binding along that 45-degree angle, and you're also going to fold it down. What it's going to look like is that your binding looks like it's even with the quilt at this point. It might hang over just a tiny bit, but not very much. And that's what it's going to look like. And then you're going to begin sewing along your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And you're going to start at the very top. You're going to put it under the foot. You start at the very top and you come down just like you were before along your 1/4 of an inch seam, and you go down your quilt. Once you've came along and you've completed all 4 corners, the next thing that you will need to do is join your sections of binding together from where you began and where you've ended.
Now let's have a look at this flap that you left earlier when you began sewing down here. You want to open this up when you've reached it and fold it up some. See how it takes some a place to hold your hand to get this done. And you're going to set your piece that is approaching it from where you're sewing. I had to rip out a few stitches actually to give myself a little bit more room. And you're going to set this one in here. You're going to raise this one up. You see that it's past your fold here, and you're going to cut it. Trying to get around my camera. It's not working too well. Now that you've got that out of the way, let's see if I can get this back in place. You have this folded. I'm going to open this one up. And you're going to glue these together, just like you glued your original ones that you were, in fact, there's one that it's coming up on. It's nice that it didn't hit in exactly the same spot. But you're going to glue here, and then you're going to set this piece on top of it and heat set it, just like you did the other pieces. The glue's not wanting to come out. I'll have to take this over to an ironing board. Now, chalk in a 1/4 to 1/4 along the line that you just, corner to corner. Chalk in corner to corner along the line that you just pressed in, and then you're going to sew along this line. I outlined it with chalk. It makes it a lot easier to see. So you have your sew line here that you just did. Before you trim all this out and cut off your little bit of excess, you want to basically, you're going to just flatten this out. You want to make sure that your binding lays flat right here, and this one's going to lay flat and straight. So now I can go back in and I'll cut out this bulk. So just like the other places, I'm going to pop it open where I've just glued, and I'm going to trim it out at 1/4 of an inch, removing all that bulk. And I'm going to finger press that little seam allowance open. Like I said, all of this is about trying to make your seams lay nice and flat on the diagonal. So now I have a nice finished joined edge in the middle of the quilt, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to finish up my seam right down to where I began. Now let's look at what we've got at this point. You've got all of your edges from both your binding and your quilt all along one point. Now right here where you've mitered your edges, this is what it's going to look like. You're going to turn it over like this. And what you're wanting to get is a 45-degree miter right here. And on the back side, you'll also get a mitered edge when you flip it over. So when you turn it over, it's going to, well, I don't have it exactly folded right, but it's going to turn into a mitered edge on the back side too. So you're going to have a 45-degree here as well. And that's the beauty of just flipping your fold over like this. So you're going to, once you've got that turned, you're going to do that to all four corners. But as you're turning, what you're going to do is you're going to come along to this side and you're going to press, actually you probably should press from this side first and then press your binding down. I have glued this down just to make it perfectly even. Or you can use like Wonder Clips and clip it down, or you can just smooth it down as you go along. I tend to smooth it down as I go along because it's quick that way. So when you're starting on your back side of your binding, I always like to start a little bit before the edge, just so I can come around my first corner. And I'm using Wonder Clips. I can't complain about those. And you're just feeding this right through. Now it's really, really nice if you already have your corners set up with clips to hold them in place. This will make it easier to turn the corners. One thing to mention is I like to have a pair, these little thread snips are helpful. I leave them in an open position if I'm feeding something like this into the machine where I want to hold on to it right up until I get to that corner spot. When I get to the corner here, let me see if you can see. Kind of awkward doing this because the camera is sitting where I normally sit. Go back on it. When I get to the corner, I'm going to turn and I'm going to sew right along this line here to tack this down. I'm going to go really slow because if there's a place where you're going to break a needle, this is a place where it could happen because it is so very bulky right there in that corner. So I'm going to back off very slowly and then I'm going to pivot around. And I'm going to come down this side. I've used white thread on this so that it contrasts enough that you can see what's happening. Just going to sew right along the edge of your binding here to tack it down. Now I've just finished the binding on the quilt, and this is how it looked. I wasn't sure originally about the color, but I like it. I think it speaks very nicely to the other colors where there's a little bit of turquoise in the quilt, and it is all finished and ready to send off to a baby. So it's at a good place. You open it up. And it's a nice size here. So I'm pleased with it. I'm ready to move on to the next project, but very pleased with this one.
So I think it's great that you've hung tight and you've completed every part of your quilt from beginning to end. If this is a first project for you, I'm really pleased for you because I remember what it was like when I completed my first quilt by myself. I was just thinking that I never knew at what point to call myself a quilter. And with my first quilt, I didn't feel like I was qualified to call myself a quilter. And at some point it kicked in. But I think that once you have your first quilt completed, you can call yourself a quilter at that point. So congratulations on your first quilt, and I'll see you next week. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more compulsive quilting and embroidery videos.